Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit, the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes. Okay, now let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Alternative Exit. Today we are joined by a luminary in the field of employee ownership, Christopher Mackin. Chris has had a distinguished career spanning 4.5 decades in the field. He is the founder and president of Ownership Associates, a consulting firm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that firm really specialized in the development and support of employee-owned companies. And it's actually how I came across Chris when I was reading the book of one of our earlier guests, where he got a notable mention for helping them through that transition. So Chris is also a fellow at the Rutgers University School of Management and Labour Relations, where he teaches a course on democratic capitalism and also contributes to the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at the same university. He's also playing an active role in shaping the policies that govern employee ownership. He participates in employee ownership symposiums around the world. The list goes on of how Chris is contributing to the movement. So we won't labour on with that. Let's get on with the conversation. Chris, welcome to the Alternative Exit.
Why, thank you, Andy. I'm going to have to report to my family that I'm a luminary.
I thought you'd like that, but it is. We've been interviewing quite a few people on the pod for the podcast and meeting sort of other people around it, and your name is consistently mentioned. So yeah, we're very excited that you're here to join us today. So you've obviously got a wealth of experience around sort of policy creation, like helping form policies, but there's a real practical element where you've sort of obviously taken that sort of much more academic thinking, but then also applied it in lots of real world examples, which I think is really going to resonate with our audience today. The first question, I wanted to sort of go back to an interview that you did recently where you talked about the long history of employee ownership in the States, tracing back to the early and mid-19th century. And I'd love it if you could just sort of, I guess, retell some of that, the learnings you had from your readings of that back in the time.
I'm actually trained as a social scientist. I've got a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education up the street here, wrote a thesis called The Social Psychology of Ownership in 1984. Mm-hmm. And so my work in the field of workplace democracy, we can call it that, grew out of a prior assignment as a graduate student to try to introduce sensible ideas of school democracy in high schools here in the Northeast. And I worked with a professor named Kohlberg here in Cambridge, who is a fairly prominent guy who was sort of working under the sort of influence of 19th century, 20th century thinkers like John Dewey and Jean Piaget. And I was very interested in that work. We did some democratic school experiments or set up institutions within Cambridge and Brookline, Massachusetts high schools. And
mm-hmm.
that was all very interesting. But the sort of the backstory before I get to the 19th century, in 1976 or so, when I was doing this work, I was meeting people around town who were trained in different disciplines, in economics and in history and management. And it occurred to me, in the reading I was doing, I discovered this idea of democracy in our social institutions of life had a very interesting, not very well understood back history in the workplace. And it occurred to me at the time, as somebody who was hammering away at democratic schools, that the problem of a lack of democracy and a lack of critical thinking and getting kids to deliberate about what's right and wrong probably had its sources upstream in the economy and in the structures of money and power and how we think about hierarchy and how we think about how we work together.
Mm-hmm.
And that while that work in the schools is important, and people have continued to sort of pound away at making schools more deliberative and alive for kids. I was convinced, or in the late '70s, that the idea of looking at what could be done in workplaces was a good idea. And what did I discover? I discovered, of course, that it was not my idea, and that hardworking, idealistic people had taken this on decades before and around the world. So the vanity that we can sometimes engage in, that what we're what we're doing is brilliant breakthrough work. We're just sort of working on the backs of people who have tried to do this for many, many years. And so let's just take it back to the dawn of industrialization, and where people are coming off of farms and small shops and are kind of confronted with the ambiguous brilliance and power of the steam engine that is going to. We're coming on AI right now, so I think we're dealing with a similar sort of disruption, but where people were going to be pulled off of farms and small shops, and particularly that manufacturing was going to be done at scale and not in small shops, and that this idea of coming together in an industrial workplace where the steam engine was driving the sewing machine or whatever was done in small shops, it's now being done at scale. That created the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution came, and it changed everything. It pulled people from, and I don't want to idealize what the pre-industrial life was like. There were plenty of challenges to it, but it pulled people who were more or less self-reliant on their labor, and their ability to farm, their ability to make stuff, into these sort of common workplace employment arrangements, which were foreign and which were of a very, very mixed, development. They were, on the one hand, they brought modernity and scale and efficiencies that were not previously there. On the other hand, they introduced an employment relationship that was different from how people had been working in the past. I mean, you may have been a peasant and working off of somebody else's land, but at least you were more or less working for yourself. You may have had to give some of your crops to the Lord or whatever, but there was a way in which you were working for yourself. And certainly when you were in small shops, you were doing that. Well, the employment relationship that was born with the Industrial Revolution, coming into working in buildings with four walls and electricity powering these things, came along with people of wealth who were able to pay for those initial machines, saying to the people in the countryside, come to work for me, and you're going to be this thing called an employee. I'm going to be the employer. You will work 10 hours a day and Saturdays initially, and I'll be paying you this wage, and you won't have to worry about certain things. But at the end of the deal, at the end of the process, I'll be the one reaping the rewards from this, because I paid for the building and I paid for these machines. And so you come on in, everybody, and in a really important way, give up your independence that you knew in the farm and the small shop, because you're working for me now. Well, that narrative, simplified by me, had mixed reception, and the thing which sort of attracted me as a young guy reading about all of this is that there were workers and what we would call managers today, people with technical skills, who resisted this idea, who said, I'm not going to give up my independence and go to work for some rich European. As a matter of fact, we just fought a war here for political independence and for a political republic, and we pushed these people out back to Europe, and we were governing ourselves. And now they're here, their sons and grandsons, mostly men, coming back over here again, wanting to control our lives. This time, not our government, but they're going to control our day-to-day lives through this thing called industry and it's an industrial workplace. And they said, well, one of them, George McNeil, one of my favorites, a labor leader and a former mayor he ran for mayor of Boston. He didn't win that, but up in Amesbury, Massachusetts, he said, well, if our parents and grandparents fought for a political republic, point one, and if point two, industry and the Industrial Revolution is here to stay and the workplace is going in this direction, then we shall have an industrial republic that is consistent with our political republic. We are not going to go to work for the same people who were governing us in an undemocratic way in the past. We shall have democracy in the workplace. And so that's the symphony that caught me as a young guy, and I was off to the races. And I'll shut up for your clarifying questions. But these little mini narratives don't happen in one head. I mean, this is happening because of the people I was meeting. I was meeting David Ellerman first and foremost, who's still my close partner, who's in his mid 80s or something now, and living in Slovenia. He's vital. He just published his 13th book or something. Who I think is perhaps the leading intellectual in the field, PhD in math, master's in economics, master's in philosophy, and he and I and another fellow started a nonprofit to actually do this work. I met Joseph Blasi, who was a graduate student here at Harvard, and Doug Cruz, who was a graduate student here at Harvard, who later have been the founders of the Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers. And so there was this community of people, and later Fred Freundlich and Lauren Rogers and people who worked with me here at Ownership Associates. You don't come up with this stuff alone. But to be clear, what got me on the path was history.
Yeah, I love that. I love that view of history. I mean, when I speak to people about employee ownership today, there's some of the looks that I get. It's there like as you're crazy, and then it's sitting there going, "Oh, like you're a communist." You go, "Well, no, you're painting a picture that's well before Karl Marx was even around."
Exactly. Karl Marx, when George McNeil made that wonderful remark about political republics, the industrial republics have got to come along to be consistent with political republics. Karl Marx, I believe, was 8 years old. And so he was kicking his little soccer ball in the backyard in Trier. This wasn't socialism. This was, some kind of republicanism or republicanization of the workplace, frankly, and so it's not fair. And it's a kind of fear that people, if they're going to throw that idea at you, that means they don't want to contend with the underlying questions. And the underlying questions is, how do we work together?
Yeah.
How do we work together and make money together in an efficient and fair, responsible way to the community? Those are the questions. So anybody who wants to cut off this discussion by saying, "Oh, that's socialism." First of all, socialism is government ownership. It's not worker ownership. It's not employee ownership. But these are people who don't want to sort of slow down and say, okay, what's the fair arrangement? How are we going to sort of structure ourselves to be able to compete and do a good job and reward the people who are doing the work? Those are the questions. That has nothing to do with an ism.
Yeah.
Totally
agree. So, where do you think we really diverged from George McNeil's vision of the Industrial Republic? Because it feels like we are so far from that today.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't want to be too romantic about this, but it's because of opportunism and greed, and on the part of a critical mass of people who had money, and their money wasn't all generated here. I mean, it was, they came with it from Europe too, right? I mean, this was not, this was a more democratic, Jeffersonian, equitable world in the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. But more money kept coming in, and with it, kind of control over this kind of a discourse. But what's interesting to me is that, there are cracks in this ideological system, again, that have very little to do with the socialist framing and Marx and that stuff. blocking on his name right now, but it'll come to me. But there have been industrialists. I mean, Leland Stanford himself,
Yeah.
Robert Brookings. I mean, there have been people of wealth who sort of reflected on how they are making their money, what it came from, and they thought that this is, there's more than one way of doing this, and that in fact we may have gotten capitalism, sort of started on the wrong foot, of giving to capital, which is a resource. It's a very useful, necessary resource to do what we're trying to do. You have to risk money, it's not necessarily going to work and so forth, but to give it perpetual voice and governance and control over what we're trying to do, that struck a number of thoughtful industrialists of the 19th and 20th century as fundamentally wrong. And they weren't like turning their pockets out to give their money away. They were saying, we can structure our workplaces, we can structure our economy in a more equitable and responsible way, and we can steer away from this model. And this is getting into political theory and so forth, but a war of labor versus capital. This is like I understand where the imagery of the war and that kind of struggle comes, and I think it's at least partially true, but that framing has a kind of abstract inevitability about it that I think is not true to the facts. I mean, because people don't want to be at war either.
Yeah.
Even the ones who are being screwed the most, they don't necessarily want to, they don't want to hate their boss. I mean, people want to come together and make stuff and be proud of what they're doing, And so this gets back, Andy, to that, what is more a political metaphor. And this is what, I mean, I feel pretty strongly about this, is that the image of what we are aiming for here still, and it's not perfect because of, the modern economy we're in, but is of an industrial republic of people are of workplaces as mini republics, where people are, where there's, like in the political republics, we figure out rational ways of appointing our leaders and keeping them responsible and delegating authority and power, to carry on the will of the people. That we do that politically as citizens, and we can and should be doing that as in workplaces, where you got your 50, 500, 10,000 workers, or are coming together the imagery should be as an industrial republic, where we're actually not at war with each other. We're trying to succeed in the marketplace and work together. That's not just psychological happy talk that you get from the organizational development crowd, where we're all a family and we're going to love each other and so forth. No, it's tougher than that, because it's about debates, it's about fairness and about structures that make sure that we're really getting the best results. And so it means the people who are in power, the ways in which they're in power in our workplaces right now, if this vision of an industrial republic was to take place, are going to have to share power and share governance. I guess this gets into the influence allocation stuff you want to talk about.
But I think this is the part what I'm loving about what you're saying, what you're talking about here is also, as I said, it's not just soft and fluffy, right? It actually it's not just soft and fluffy, like the organization. There is a sort of there is a harsh element that comes to that, or not a harsh, but more that's a deliberate and refined effort, like that it comes to, because ultimately it seems like you need to have that accountability, right? When you're in this relationship with the people who are coming to work with you every day, you need to be accountable that you're going to do your job and move the organization the direction you want to take it.
Right. Well, if I might, so let me address that. So yes, you're right. This isn't just happy talk. There are going to be conflicts, but in an industrial republic, in a well-functioning industrial republic, here's the beauty of it. It's like you're in some kind of a democratic or quasi-democratic environment. You are. And you're going to have conflicts. You're going to say, no, we should be making X and not Y. We should be doing this with our budget instead of this. And if you are in a healthy democratic environment and you're having good debates about that and you lose, you believe that there is another day.
Yeah.
You're not going to set fire to the workplace. you know that, okay, I lost this election.
Yeah.
I've got to do a better job in making my case. The next time around, we're going to debate the budget. That's a beautiful thing. Now, that's not that's a beautiful thing in terms of sort of a democratic, describing a democratic life. It's got conflicts. It's got feelings. It's got differences. It's got votes.
It's got nuance.
But it's got nuance, but it isn't like a war of all against all. It isn't just benevolent permissions that like nice guys and gals are giving to workers and then taking them away when the next day or when they get fired, somebody new comes in. It's got a structural integrity to it, and that's what you have to have to get people to believe in this because it's not just happy talk.
So you talked earlier about sort of the underlying question: how do we work together? Which I thought I just love the simplicity of that question, and you've helped a lot of companies transition to this employee ownership model. How important is changing that organizational culture and employee engagement as part of that transition?
Yes. Okay. So the starting point to answer that question is that employee ownership is firstly a legal and financial transaction. The privileges and responsibilities of ownership are being transferred from one person or a small group of people to the full group, and that's done with lawyers and accountants and bankers. But the evidence is clear from our friends at Rutgers and elsewhere that if you want to succeed with this, the fun really begins when the lawyers and bankers are gone and people are making sense of what is it that's different here now that we all own the company together. And the beauty and it's got more than one side to it, I guess. But and I know some people disagree with me on this, but the legal structure that we've got here in the United States, dominated by employee stock ownership plans, is that it sets a very low floor for what you have to do by way of voice and participation. And that is, as a young man, I didn't really like that very much. I wanted there to be more guarantees of democracy and so forth and so on. But I've come to believe, that people need to be convinced, that there are rational ways of doing this, that figuring out how to make a democratic workplace isn't something that really can just be imposed from the outside. There's a lot of sui generis, in sort of invention that has to happen if you want to get the right results. Now, to be clear, the downside of that is that particularly paranoid or controlling people can just have the ownership be a pure legal structure thing, and people get a piece of paper once a year that tells them what their stock is worth, and they're never engaged about, hey, what should we do differently now that we all own the company together? Well, the evidence is pretty clear that if you don't engage people and you don't take this as an opportunity, then you're not going to get much in the way of a productivity advantage or an efficiency advantage. I mean, people may like this idea that, okay, I get this extra, it's like a little 401k boost or something, but there's no different conversation going on. Employee ownership creates the potential for that conversation. And that's where I come in, and my colleagues, who work the after the transaction side of the fence. The field is dominated roughly by two groups: the people who do the transactions, and then the people who help out after the transaction is done. And I'm a partner at American Working Capital, which is a transaction group now too. Get into talking about why I did that, but I've started and continue to have a fair amount of my time in the after the transaction side of things, which is where the human and organizational work happens.
We'll touch on that sort of, human organizational work in just a second. But there was something that you mentioned, sort of obviously about the limitations of the ESOP model, and we've had lots of conversations on the podcast with previous guests around the different types of models that we've got around the world. Which sort of legal structure do you think best looks after both the legal element and the employee engagement piece?
Okay, well, um, I am partial to the employee stock ownership plan model that sort of dominates the numbers here in the United States. It is a model that is in continual need of improvement and reform, but the basic elements of it that are rather hard to beat begin with one fact: the fact of the possibility of individual workers and groups of workers sharing in capital appreciation, in wealth building, and not just being owners in what is in effect a nonprofit for profit, where where they're not able to share in capital appreciation. And here I'm talking candidly, and I think of the EOT world, where employee ownership trust world, which does share profits, really another income stream after, when they can. If they're paying down acquisition debt, that could be hard to do. But workers do not have capital appreciation. They're not sharing in wealth. They're sharing in income. And that's a concession that I'm not enthusiastic about.
Okay.
I believe we're trying to create a kind of democratic capitalism here. We are trying to give people a chance to have, their piece of the action of wealth, in addition to being paid well in their wages and their income. And one of the reasons why the EOT friends are making some inroads are a couple of points. One is in smaller companies, setting up an ESOP is really very hard to do and expensive. And an EOT or a cooperative are better structures for that. And with enough sort of foresight and thinking, you can approximate wealth sharing and capital appreciation through your profit sharing distributions of a small EOT company. I concede that point. But I guess, Andy, I look at this from the big picture and history, and the debate that should be going on is going on to some degree with mainstream economic theory and public policy about how our economy should work. And if we're going to take away capital appreciation, as an element that's describing a segment of our economic life of democratic firms, if we're saying that democratic firms only work because we take away capital appreciation, well, we have to ask, what are we giving away? Not only what are we giving away from the making it possible for these workers to have some money for their kids to go to college and so forth and so on, and to get homes, but what are we giving away in terms of like the dynamism of the firms themselves economically, as they are competing, as we are competing with more, sort of free market, on the loose, private equity firms and publicly traded companies, that have the capital to be able to reinvest and to grow. So we have to ask the question of, how are our employee ownership structures able to compete with mainstream capitalist institutions? And if we're putting a lid on them in terms of how they're operating, are they going to be able to compete? I mean, that's not just a question about how the workers are faring. It's also about how this sector is able to sort of compete with more conventional models.
Look, I love that sort of, I guess that line that you put there with regards to the capital appreciation. It's definitely not something you hear a lot of, obviously, when you speak to the EOT folks, because that's not a part of that. And as you sort of point out that, hey, look, you can create that style structure with sort of the profit sharing arrangements. But yet again, that comes down to the benevolence of the trustee board and sort of whoever's setting that up at the time, which again takes it away from the workers. So yeah, I do love that point. So I just want to go just I mean, just quickly, if you're thinking about, to think about quickly to your experience in implementing these employee-owned structures, what is the biggest challenge for companies? What do you find is the biggest challenge for them to make in this cultural change?
Well, in terms of cultural change inside the organizations?
Inside the organization, yeah.
Okay. Sure. I mean, I think let's to try to color that in a little bit. Let's imagine together, organizations of 100 people and above or whatever. Okay.
Yep.
Just so, well, what kind of a workplace are we having in mind here? And I think the starting point for me is, sort of what kind of brilliance and innovation and better ideas maybe exist in this workplace that when conventionally structured, conventionally owned, we're not hearing from people. We're not asking them the questions, and they don't feel the permission to be able to come up with innovations and ideas necessarily, or they feel a very low level of permission or motivation to do so.
Yeah.
So we are, because they are rented humans, they're employees. They're not the owners, right? And so rented humans, people treated as rented humans will behave as rented humans, largely. Many of them will want to break through that because they have better ideas and they want the workplace to succeed. But they may be easily defeated because they feel that's not their place, or they're not being invited to do that. You ask about the cultural conditions. I mean, that's generally where you start. We go into companies that are being converted to employee ownership. You've got these people who've been treated as employees and rented humans more or less well. They can be treated kindly, but they aren't necessarily being treated as adults or as partners, and so then the question is, are we opening the kimono here? Are we doing something different because we're part owners together? And if so, how do we start that? Well, you start that by talking and sharing data and information of what's going on with your company and what you're up against. Who's the competition? What's the competitive environment? To be able to survive. All these things that the people at the top of the house worry about privately, and in their quiet little offices. It's about sharing some of that and sharing the opportunity to respond to it. To come up with ideas about how to either do what we're doing already better, or maybe breaking into some related new line of work. Well, just a bit of a tangent. So one of my pet recommendations for every ESOP company that I work with these days is that I say in every ESOP company, there should be a futures committee. Okay.
A futures committee.
A futures committee.
Okay.
And ideally with a rotating membership where everybody, and the futures committee asks a very simple question. What else could we be doing different from what we're doing now? Up to and including different lines of work, that presumably have some adjacency to what we know how to do well right now, but that are like new directions forward for this group of 100 people or 500 people, because we're brilliant and we care about each other, we're skilled, and we could be doing this and that. And where they refine those ideas, with a sort of limited amount of time and budget and so forth, and they have them ready, to sort of present to the board of directors of the company, maybe to present to the General Assembly or something. And at minimum, these are contingency plans, for what to do if things go bad in our main line of business. At maximum, they're like growth opportunities.
Yeah.
That are being intelligently thought through by people. So, look, you can have a futures committee in a standard capitalist firm, but what kind of motivation are the rented humans applying to this task of imagining the future versus a group of partners, of part owners who feel like they're part owners, for whom this is one of the things that some subgroup of their, that's got a little time and resources to do this, is delegated to do.
Yep.
To bring back to, and here's the second point of this. I'm going to shut up. The second institutional, besides the Futures Committee, the second institutional recommendation that I have is to have annual meetings, and maybe 2 meetings a year, whatever, which are structured but somewhat freewheeling, where budgets are debated and discussed, and choices, are debated and discussed, and where there's, again, some transparency about how to navigate forward, that's happening in full view of the people working at the company. And where in advance of these big meetings, there are smaller meetings so that people have sort of prepared something to be able to talk. And where ideally you structure with full foreknowledge and total enthusiasm a debate between different camps about what we should do, where there's no obvious, it's a healthy debate about where we go. And whether the people vote on the winner of the debate, that's not that material, but it's at least it's evidence of the introduction of some kind of intelligent deliberation among the citizens of the workplace there, among the members of the workplace, about what it is we're doing. And that's happening, that needs to be planned for, that needs to be budgeted, that needs to be happening in order to give a reality to the claim that we're an employee-owned company, because we're talking about our business.
I love those super practical elements, and even just the way you talk about establishing those debates is, I don't know, it seems like that is so required in today's sort of political environment, to actually have teach people on how to disagree and how to have that argument and conversation.
Well, no, this gets back to what I was saying earlier, that when you're really doing something right, is when the losers of those debates are reasonably happy people. Like, hey, we gave it a good shot.
Yeah.
And we got another chance at the next debate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when you have a healthy organization. And that's not all flowers and love and everybody get in a circle and squeeze each other. No, this is about, about being able to debate.
Yeah. Well, debate. Yeah, it's about everyone having a different opinion about sort of moving towards a common goal.
Yeah. Which doesn't mean you're at war with it. Which doesn't mean you're at war with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Look, Chris, we could keep talking for hours. I could keep peppering you with questions, I'm sure, on many, many topics. But before we go, I'd just like to ask you a fast round of questions. I'm just going to ask you 3 questions and you offer a quick response. How does that sound?
Sure.
Okay. Who is the leader that you most admire in employee ownership?
David Ellerman.
Okay. That was a quick one.
That's Ellerman.org, everyone.
We'll have a link to that one in the show notes.
Right.
What is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
It's a tie between the National Center for Employee Ownership and the ESOP Association of America. Okay. That is a politic response. Okay.
I like it. And then finally, what would you say to a business owner who is sitting on the fence regarding a transition to employee ownership?
Well, I have those conversations a lot. I would say, you can't live forever. What do you want to leave behind? How do you want your story to be told? And who makes your success possible. Every day a third of them may drive you crazy, and a third of them you may be crazy about, love them, and the other, the ones are in the middle, but they're your people. And look, this gets a final little advert here into the Employee Equity Investment Act, which is the policy work that I'm doing with Dick May and Jack Moriarty, Dick May of American Working Capital and Jack Moriarty of Lafayette Square Foundation. The business of persuading business owners to sell to their employees we need to up our game here in the United States and get beyond the practice of using seller financing as the primary way in which this is done. You've got a business worth $100 million. The bank is going to loan you, 50 million, 60 million of that at tops with secured assets. Where's the risk capital going to come from that pays you out entirely as the founder of the firm? The practice of the last 20, 30, 40 years with ESOPs has been seller notes because because the workers don't have the money. They're not going to be able to come up with the money, and we shouldn't expect them to. Just as we didn't expect soldiers coming back from World War II to have the money to be able to buy homes, we came up with federal credit guarantees to financial institutions to create the home mortgage industry. So the Employee Equity Investment Act would extend those same federal credit guarantees to private equity-like investment funds that can supply the necessary capital, the missing equity capital, to make employee ownership a truly competitive alternative for business owners who are ready to sell, and not saddling them with the obligation to use seller notes to be able to finance the sale of their own business. To be able to do it efficiently, at competitive prices, sort of eliminating concerns about seller notes potentially not being set at the right price. The Labor Department worries about that. If we create a niche within private equity, of democratic private equity, assisted by these federal credit guarantees, then you're going to get competitive prices. The sellers are going to be able to sell efficiently. They're going to get a fair price, and there is no self-dealing involved in this. That's what the Employee Equity Investment Act is intended to do, is to help launch a new set of careers for people coming out of law schools and business schools to be able to do democratic private equity and be able to create employee ownership that's going to last beyond one cohort of workers, because that kind of capital is there for growth capital purposes as well as for new transactions. So,
yeah, it means that the first generation can really benefit from that as well. Like they're not just stuck playing down.
We need to really up our game in terms of financial infrastructure to make that happen.
Well, Chris, I think that's just testament to the types of leadership that you're displaying, and you have been for many decades with regards to employee ownership. Thank you very much for joining us here today and for your leadership over the past. And okay. I'll be sure we'll have links in the notes as to where people can reach out to you.
Sounds good. Take care. Have a good day.
Chris.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.